Let me start with, well, I'll throw this question first to Bill Black. In the area of prosecutions, what's been the biggest difference between the S&L crisis and the crisis that began in 2007?
1,000 versus 0. In the savings and loan crisis, there were over 1,000 felony convictions in what the FBI and Justice Department labeled major cases. That's a term of art. In the current crisis, of the senior insiders at the non-prime lenders that drove the crisis, there have been 0 convictions. So that's the starkest difference. You can now loot with impunity.
Well, take that a little farther. That's a stark difference, but why the difference when clearly so much more has gone wrong in the S&L crisis? In this recent crisis than the S&L crisis.
Yeah. When I am asked, I mean, admittedly it's flaky to guess at a relationship, I call this crisis 40 times the size of the savings and loan crisis. The savings and loan crisis didn't cause a general economic crisis. It didn't cause a recession. It didn't lead to the budget hysteria and such. It didn't lead to 10 million people losing their jobs. All of those things have happened in the current crisis. So you can divide the reasons in 2 broad categories as to why it's not happening. One is intrinsic to the type of fraud. It is, in fact, difficult to prosecute. And the second is the things that we've added or failed to use in this crisis compared to prior ones. People, I think, generally assume from watching movies and shows that FBI agents can make these kinds of sophisticated financial cases. In reality, there are fewer FBI agents that specialize in white-collar crime than there are industries. So definitionally, the FBI cannot have expertise. You know, it might have 2 or 3 agents that really know banking fairly well, but that's not going to let you bring a whole series of cases in an epidemic. So everything has to start in the banking context with the regulators. And my metaphor is that we have to serve as the Sherpas, and in both senses of what a Sherpa does. We have to do the heavy lifting in the investigations because we have far more resources, and we have to serve as the guide function because we have the expertise as to how normal banking operates and how to distinguish it from fraudulent banking. In the savings and loan crisis, it varied a bit by who was chairman of the agency, or once the Office of Thrift Supervision was created, who was director. But for much of the time period, the top priority of the agency was to close the S&Ls that were controlled by frauds. And the second highest priority in much of the time period, but again, not all, was to assist in putting those frauds in prison. So that's where it all begins. You have to not only say that it is a top priority, you have to actually do it. And that brings us to the concept of institutionalization. In the savings and loan debacle, when you start out, as late as 1986, things look fairly similar to now. There are virtually no major prosecutions as of 1986. Criminal referrals are flawed. They're inadequate, and they're not necessarily high quality. What happens is actually democracy, like the good old theory of it. Doug Barnard, a moderately senior representative in the House and someone who started as a bank examiner and then worked for banks, held some hearings in which he greatly embarrassed the agency, the Federal Home Loan Bank, Bank Board, and the criminal justice apparatus, the FBI and the Justice Department. And that led the head of the agency to say, well, we've got to change things. So am I going on too long about this, or?
Well, let me let Jim Barth jump in here a little bit, and maybe particularly follow up on some of the areas that Bill addressed, both in the amount of work that's out there in terms of the difficulty to prove fraud, and secondly, how do you view the comparison between this crisis and the S&L crisis? Are we going to see prosecutions down the road on the scale of what we saw in the late 80s and into the early 90s?
Well, let me start by saying that I don't disagree with Bill. I think, indeed, there are many more actions taken against executives at savings and loans than appears to be the case so far with respect to banking institutions that suffered during the most recent crisis. I find it interesting that the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, when he was interviewed by the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, stated that the most recent crisis is indeed far more severe than even the crisis during the 1930s, that is the Great Depression. So one would have thought that there'd be more cases brought against executives, officers and directors of institutions for wrongdoing. Now, of course, I tend to take the view that one has to focus not just on the officers and directors of the institutions that got into trouble, and perhaps got into trouble because of the actions taken by those very same officers and directors. I think also, and this is changing the subject a bit, we don't have to move in this direction, but that we also have to focus more on the regulatory authorities. Bill mentioned the regulatory authorities have to be involved if we're going to go after executives of institutions for wrongdoing. But I think we have to ask the question about the culpability of the regulatory authorities themselves in contributing to the factors that actually generated the crisis. And also, why is it that the regulatory authorities aren't doing more with respect to uncovering wrongdoing at the very institutions that they were responsible for seeing operated in a safe and sound manner? The difference between criminal and civil prosecutions, is it his view that it's more criminal wrongdoing, or is it a matter of using civil penalties with respect to trying to hold individuals at institutions responsible?
There are many things, and all of them good ideas to discuss, and we can go on for a very considerable time period. Yes, we in the criminology biz and we as regulators think very much in terms of what are the incentive structures. And, of course, this is the heart of economics as well. And I think we're going to get fairly broad agreement that incentive structures were made pervasively perverse in both of these crises, and exceptionally perverse in the current crisis, and that the regulatory response was dramatically delayed in the current crisis compared to key time periods in the savings and loan crisis. So let's go through the recipe for accounting control fraud. This is just a standard optimization issue. Now, as criminologists, we don't think people truly optimize in some of the most absurd neoclassical fashions of perfection, but most economists don't either. So that really, we tend to be fairly consistent in that as well. It has 4 ingredients. 1, grow like crazy. 2, make really bad loans at a premium yield. 3, extreme leverage. And 4, trivial loss reserves against the coming deluge of losses. If you do those 4 things, you are mathematically guaranteed in the short term to report record profits. This is why Akerlof and Romer, in their famous 1993 article, Looting the Economic Underworld of Bankruptcy for Profit, refer to this mechanism as a quote-unquote sure thing. And we use that same phrase in criminology. In fact, he stole it from us. The first two ingredients in that recipe are related. In other words, even if I were running a fraud, in an ideal world, I'd actually love to make good loans, and I'd love to grow extremely rapidly. But that isn't possible in a mature, reasonably competitive marketplace. Because if I want to grow very rapidly, and certainly if 100 institutions want to grow very rapidly, this brings in the fallacy of composition. In a competitive, mature market, the only way to do that is to buy market share by substantially dropping yield. And of course, your competitors will match you. And at the end of the day, you don't end up with all much increased volume, but you end up with a very shattered yield. And the result is that you report losses as opposed to gains. So that strategy doesn't work. But it turns out there are tens of millions of people who are not creditworthy. And if we can bring them in, we can guarantee our ability to grow very rapidly, and we can charge them a premium yield. And so that's what drives the mathematics and what, of course, makes this exceptionally perverse.
But if I could stop you. If I could
Let me just add two links, and then I'll do that. First, this makes, using modern executive compensation, this makes the executives incredibly wealthy. This is the import of Akerlof and Romer about the bankruptcy for profit through looting. And the second thing is, this same recipe is simultaneously a formula that maximizes fictional short-term income and real long-term losses. Sorry. Over to you, Jim.
Sure, Bill.
Go ahead, Jim.
My response to what you said is that I don't agree with the scenarios that you lay out, but my concern is that what you've described is not necessarily illegal on the part of the executives at those institutions, to the extent that that information is all publicly made available, not only to lots of ordinary people in society, but also to the regulatory authorities. So it gets back to the issue, if all of this information is publicly available, why is it the regulatory authorities don't step in and curtail those types of activities? To be sure that indeed down the road there won't be losses that ultimately perhaps taxpayers will have to cover.
All good questions. So first, in 1990 and 1991, when we were the West region of the Office of Thrift Supervision, it was California Savings and Loans, and it was almost exclusively California Savings and Loans that began to do heavy amounts of non-prime lending. And we squashed that by normal supervisory means because they were following the formula that we talked about, that recipe. And by the way, another key aspect analytically of that recipe is that you have to suborn your underwriting, because you have an entire policy of making bad loans. And of course, banks typically have, depending on their size, anywhere between 10 and 15 layers of controls designed to prevent you from making bad loans. So you have to suborn your underwriting and your internal and external controls to be able to do that. And when you do that, you maximize adverse selection. And when you maximize adverse selection, you create a negative expected value to the transaction. Now, honest firms don't characteristically engage in transactions with negative expected value. And we've known for centuries that adverse selection produces this. And we know that mortgages are so large that you can't treat them like you treat credit cards, right? Credit cards is essentially a lemons market. Typically, where they don't bother to underwrite very well, and they charge people a much higher rate that takes into account the poor credit quality. That doesn't work in home mortgages. They're too large, too lumpy, and such. So you simply go bankrupt, and you are guaranteed. Again, that's the bankruptcy for profit aspect of all these. Now step back a second, because Jim asks a very useful question. Let's assume hypothetically that this is lawful. If it is, then we have a bigger disaster. Because we have a sure thing that produces massive losses, and which on top of that is a superb device for hyperinflating bubbles, something that Akerlof and Romer again talked about in their 1993 article about how this helped hyperinflate the regional bubble in Texas. Step back. Sorry, go ahead.
I wanted to see if I could, if you want to wrap, I want to see if I can ask you both a specific question on fraud and get your reaction to it. But if you want to finish up your thought there, go ahead.
What I was going to say is the fact that information is public doesn't mean that there isn't fraud, because under the securities law, if you're publicly traded, must follow GAAP. GAAP requires loss reserves against future losses that are expected. When you have adverse selection, the expected losses are massive. In fact, if you put appropriate loss reserves, you would, of course, reflect what the economic truth is, that these are negative expected sum transactions. In other words, loss reserves would exceed the purported income, and you'd be showing from the beginning that making a liar's loan meant that you were lending at a loss.
Just one quick
comment.
And that
was not done.
One quick comment, Bill.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to add a response that, of course, one has to realize that there are independent auditors auditing these financial institutions. There are also regulatory authorities that go in, pay attention to what the independent auditors say about loan loss reserves, other sort of balance sheet items. And it's the regulatory authorities that can easily ask institutions to reserve more, put up more capital, do those sorts of things. So we come back to the fact that one can focus on fraud inside an institution, but one also should hold accountable the external governance authorities, such as the regulatory authorities. We all know the Office of Thrift Supervision, where we had once worked, or at least worked for the predecessor of the Office of Thrift Supervision, the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, that the agency did a particularly lousy job. It did then during the savings and loan crisis, and more recently, the Office of Thrift Supervision did a particularly lousy job, failed to fulfill its responsibility. Look at the big institutions that failed under the watchful eyes of the Office of Thrift Supervision. You have IndyMac, Washington Mutual, Countrywide, AIG to some degree. So again, I think it's one thing to point out fraud, but I think one has to go beyond and also look at the regulatory authorities and whether or not they were fulfilling their responsibility to the American public.
And Jim, on that, on that Office of Thrift Supervision, they were called out in this recent Senate report. So what do you do in a case like that? Is that an agency that should be dissolved, absorbed by another agency, or entirely changed? I mean, clearly they weren't reporting problems at Washington Mutual and elsewhere.
Well, the agency, the Office of Supervision, is indeed being, quote, abolished. It's actually being merged into the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. When Bill and I were in Washington, our agency, in the eyes of the Congress and the President, did a bad job, so they effectively abolished the agency. What that meant is we simply changed the name of the agency. It had been the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, and it became the Office of Thrift Supervision. In this particular case, the agency, the Office of Thrift Supervision, once again is being abolished, but effectively, in this case, it's going to be merged in the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. I don't think anybody particularly loses a job or anything. There's not much done to the former heads of the agencies.
Bill,
Okay,
do you want to have a quick response to the Office of comment about the regulators there?
No, I want to have a longer response because
Go ahead.
Because it's a really interesting story and very important for all the things we're worried about in terms of how you go forward and make things better. Absolutely. If you deregulate, desupervise these industries, then you create an incredibly criminogenic environment, right? An environment that is going to create wide-scale, what we call accounting control fraud. And the Office of Thrift Supervision and the Federal Home Loan Bank Board are superb case studies, but they're more complicated than Jim's overview, and the complications are really important to what we're going to discuss, I think. So we don't have to do it at this segment, but we should come back to where the agencies were successful, which is often far more than private market discipline, and where they were, in fact, actually destructive. And, of course, we're going to find some of the same people involved in multiple aspects of the destructive aspects who shared a philosophy that was intensely anti-regulatory, intensely pro-bank, I'll call them banks, or savings and loans. And so that makes it a really interesting study and a really interesting question going forward of how do you try to make regulation more effective.
Let me ask both of you about fraud, a specific question. We mentioned how difficult it has been to prosecute in this crisis. So a question for both of you, what these days constitutes fraud in the financial markets? And should we change a few specific things in current laws on fraud? And I guess tied into that, are there examples of other countries or other markets and where their fraud laws may be tougher, something for the U.S. Financial markets and regulators to learn and to use?
Well, I'm going to reject the initial premise of your question that it is exceptionally difficult to prosecute, and that explains the lack of prosecutions now. I agree that intrinsically sophisticated white-collar crimes are difficult, certainly compared to many blue-collar. But that was true in the savings and loan crisis as well. And indeed, commercial real estate transactions, which is what drove the savings and loan crisis, are dramatically more complex than a liar's loan. After all, liar's loan's among the simplest things in existence because there ain't nothing there, pretty much, that's verified, which is the point. We've known for centuries that creates intense adverse selection. And we've known for centuries that if you see that, that's a tremendous marker of fraud. So how did we get more than 90% success in convictions in the savings and loan crisis? Well, that goes back to that Sherpa function, and it is when we make the criminal referrals, we are actually creating the narrative of how the fraud scheme works. And that's what a prosecutor has to do. At the end of the day, in law, and I don't say this in a disparaging way, you have to convince people, and that means you have to construct a logical narrative, and you're going to have the best defense lawyers in the world on the other side. So that narrative has to be compelling, it has to be logically consistent, and has to be sensible to a jury of non-experts. And that means that we create what we call rifle shot prosecutions of specific things that are easier to understand. Let me give you an example of that. For a secured lender, an honest secured lender, you would never deliberately inflate appraisal values, because after all, those are your great protection.
Sure.
And you have the ability to prevent them being inflated by others through means that we've known, again, for over a century, how to do that effectively. When you see widespread appraisal fraud, That cannot come from the borrowers. That comes from the lending institution and or its agents, the loan brokers. Washington Mutual, for example, which you mentioned, was found by then Attorney General Cuomo's investigations to have a blacklist of appraisers. But you got on the blacklist if you refused to inflate appraisals. Juries understand that very well. And so it takes skills. You have to add lawyer skills to criminology, to economics, as to how normal banking operates, and then you can distinguish why it makes no sense to make liar's loans or to inflate appraisals. But after all, the fact that they're called by the trade liar's loans is kind of a hint, folks, and it makes it a lot easier to prosecute. But we have not seen them even try. Why? Because criminal referrals against senior officers completely ceased under the Bush administration. The Office of Thrift Supervision made 0 criminal referrals. To give you, by contrast, we made well over 10,000 criminal referrals as an agency. The Office of the Comptroller made.
Let me let Jim Barth. Let me let Jim Barth jump in here. Let him pick up on the. What do you think of the premise of that question? Is it difficult to prosecute, and are there things we should change? And what about this concept where, as Bill Black talked about, this rifle shot prosecution of these specific violations?
Sure. Let me make a couple comments because Bill is, after all, an attorney, also a former litigator who actually went after individuals, helped others go after individuals who engaged in wrongdoing. So I don't want to disagree with his opening comments in which he made, I think, the surprising or disappointing point that there are a lot more prosecutions during the days of the savings loan crisis than today when we've had a much worse crisis. So I think that tells you that it perhaps is not as difficult as some might say. However, during the savings loan crisis, I know Bill and I talked about this issue many times. I tend to think that we did indeed have fraud. I think that's demonstrated. In fact, there are numerous convictions during the days of the savings and loan debacle. But it turns out I tend to think that incentives matter. They matter with respect to fraud, but other sort of behavior as well, which may not be illegal. I tended to put the cost of all the government's funds that were used to bail out the savings and loan industry at about 10%, which means that fraud accounted about for 10% of all the bailout cost during the days of the savings and loan cleanup efforts. Now, I don't know what that cost would be today associated with fraud, but I still tend to think that fraud is present. It has occurred. It's perhaps not being prosecuted to the extent that it should, but I tend to think that it's not the overwhelming factor in explaining the total cost of the current crisis. Bill said the current crisis might be an order of magnitude of 40 relative to the savings and loan crisis. I don't know what he thinks about the extent to which fraud would account for the bulk of the cost of the cleanup efforts of the bailout or the losses that were incurred. But I tend to think it's not the overriding factor. Look, when you look at all the crises we've had in this country, are they all due to fraud or largely due to fraud? What happens in the intervening years between crises? For example, what happened to fraudulent behavior after the savings and loan crisis and the commercial banking problems of the late 1980s, early 1980s, and the most recent crisis? Is it that fraud simply was no longer prevalent or didn't exist at all? Or was it undercover? Or was it waiting for a more opportune time to strike? See, so if one uses fraud as the overriding factor in explaining what has happened in the most recent crisis, where I might have a problem, Bill, is saying what happens in all the other years when we don't have crises? Why is it that fraud suddenly picks up in every 20 years or so and not in the intervening years? Is it that these individuals are waiting, or is it that there are other factors like the incentives that you mentioned and these perverse incentives being created by regulatory authorities? Is that the overriding factor? The regulatory authorities actually provide incentives. Not that they do regulate, they don't enforce the existing regulations. And then you have individuals doing all sorts of crazy things, growing institutions to large a size, making the liar loans, the ninja loans, the loans with where individuals have no income, no jobs, and no assets, things like that.
And Bill, in a recent posting, you used the term not only deregulation but de-supervision. Tie that into the question that Jim's posed to you.
Yeah, I call it the 3 Ds: deregulation, de-supervision, and de facto decriminalization. And I would say that de-supervision was the largest factor in the current crisis, because what we did was take the people most hostile to regulation and make them the head of the regulatory bodies. The most famous and iconic one, of course, is Chainsaw Gillerin, who was the head of the Office of Thrift Supervision. And the iconic photo is him holding a chainsaw. He's standing next to the 3 leading bank lobbyists in America and the deputy head of the FDIC, who will become his successor as head of the Office of Thrift Supervision. The others are all holding pruning shears, and they are poised and posed over a pile of federal regulations to demonstrate their intent to cut through all regulation. Well, mission accomplished, guys. And so what did they do? They brought back the most notorious professional regulator in America, someone that are blowing the whistle in our congressional testimony back in 1990, 1989, got demoted 5 levels, Daryl Doko. And they first had him in charge of Washington Mutual when he was up in Seattle. Then they they being the Office of Thrift Supervision, and this is called the Competition and Laxity, they wanted to get large entities to join the safe loan ranks because their assessments were based on the volume, the size of insured institutions that were chartered and regulated by the Office of Thrift Supervision. And so they assigned Daryl Doko to the task of enticing Countrywide to leave the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency and join the Office of Thrift Supervision. And the not-so-subtle message was, we will be a kinder and gentler regulatory environment for you. And as a reward for all of that, they made him head of the entire West region of the Office of Thrift Supervision, whereupon he was in charge of that entire list of institutions, basically, that Jim aptly went through. So if you look within insured institutions, the Office of Thrift Supervision was by far the worst. This is where IndyMac, WAMU, Countrywide, all of the worst frauds in the insured institution ranks were Office of Thrift Supervision. But as I say, it's a more nuanced story. Go back in time. 1990, 1991, we are way ahead of the curve in the Office of Thrift Supervision. We see this incipient behavior at a point when it's, in terms of dollar range, in the hundreds of millions of dollars, which may sound large, but in this sphere of things poses 0 systemic risk, and we kill it by normal supervisory means. Well, who were the big providers of those liars' loans back then in California? Well, that was Long Beach Savings. What happened? Roland Arnall gave up his federal charter. He had a savings and loan to escape our jurisdiction. He changed the name of the entity, made it a mortgage bank. It became AmeriQuest. AmeriQuest became the biggest and the baddest of the predatory lenders. It was sued by 49 state AGs and the Federal Trade Commission, settled for hundreds of millions of dollars. But then the key is, what was the reaction to this? What had happened ideologically in the country? and what had happened in terms of what we think of as in economics as public choice theory. Well, it turns out Roland Arnau had become the leading contributor to George W. Bush. And so instead of being removed in scandal, we made him our ambassador to the Netherlands. And even worse, so you have an entity, Ameriquest, with 1,000 employees that have been engaged in predatory lending and fraud. What happens? Washington Mutual and Citicorp acquire those entities and those personnel. Think how perverse the world has become when our most elite financial institutions want personnel like that.
Both of you have been great, very cooperative. I just want to finish on one more question and let you go about your day. And then, well, as you said, we could go on for quite some time. But my question is this. Under Dodd-Frank, it creates this new regulatory body, this Financial Stability Oversight Council. What do you think? Do you think we should expect that this body will help prevent crises, financial crises in the future? And we'll start with you, Jim Barth.
I doubt that the new council set up by the Financial Dodd-Frank Act is really going to prevent future crises. I tend to be a bit pessimistic, perhaps too pessimistic, about whether or not the new Financial Crisis Council Stability Council is going to do a good job. It turns out that we had regulatory authorities who were responsible for overseeing the financial sector. The same agencies, effectively, that were overseeing the financial system that led to the most recent crisis are now simply going to get together, by and large, and try to do a much better job. So I tend to be a pessimistic individual when it comes to the new council doing a particularly good job. After all, it turns out before the crisis, we had institutions that were too big to fail, too interconnected, or too important. After the crisis, we have even bigger institutions that are even more interconnected and more important to allow them to fail. As the Inspector General, who is overseeing the spending under the $700 billion TARP program, pointed out, he's even very pessimistic about the fact that the Dodd-Frank Act is really going to solve the too big to fail problem. I think we have a serious problem ahead of us. Every time we've had a major crisis in the United States, a financial crisis, we've done one thing, and it hasn't worked, and that's enact new laws. The new laws provide more powers to the regulatory authorities, generate more regulatory authorities, and we still, about 20, 25 years later, have another crisis. So think about it. Throughout the history of this country, major financial legislation has not prevented a subsequent crisis. But every president says the same thing. With this new law, never again, those two words, never again will we have a similar crisis, and then later we have an additional crisis. I think we have to do a much better job of holding our regulatory authorities accountable, and that's where I full-heartedly agree with Bill. The regulatory authorities in many respects have let us down. We need and should expect a much better job from them.
And I think Jim's an optimist. Not only do we have the same agencies, we have the same people. And so I told you the story about, actually, of course, it wasn't just Ameriquest. It was other people we removed and prohibited from the savings and loan industry for doing these kinds of liar's loans, simply moved over to mortgage banking where they weren't subject to federal regulation. The Fed had authority under OFHEO since 1994. 1994, to have regulated them. And they were warned, the FBI warned, for example, of an epidemic of mortgage fraud in September 2004 in its House testimony, and predicted that it would cause an economic crisis if it were not stemmed. Greenspan utterly refused to act. Bernanke utterly refused to act until the crisis had already destroyed the non-prime lending. Like Jim, I am enormously worried about these systemically dangerous institutions. And of course, it starts right there. So the administration uses this euphemism, systemically important organizations. Well, we know that they're way too large to be efficient. And so they're simply a massive risk. So the administration is telling us if a single one of these roughly 20 institutions fail, they will cause a global crisis. Well, then why do we have them? We don't need them for efficiency. We should shrink them, and Jim is quite correct. We've actually done the opposite. We've made them bigger. Now, that is significantly insane. And so we have the same anti-regulators in charge who are incredibly in bed with the largest institutions. We have no way to examine them successfully. The only, what the Fed and the comptroller end up doing with these massive institutions is having resident examiner programs. So you have 50 examiners that live at Citicorp. Well, inevitably, they will marry to the natives. Everything we know from human life says this, right?
And the revolving door between the regulatory authorities and the big institutions keeps on spinning.
Right. And you cannot rely, Jim mentioned outside auditors. Outside auditors are picked by the CEO and the CFO. And they will routinely give clean opinions to utterly fraudulent institutions that are, in fact, massively insolvent, but purport, because they are following the recipe, to show record income. And that is always going to happen because you can create a Gresham's dynamic, because you control the hiring and the firing of the compensation. And as long as we do that, the art is not to defeat controls, but to suborn them and to turn them into your most valuable allies. That's why these frauds almost always go to a top-tier audit firm, because that reputation is valuable in committing the frauds. That is why the credit rating agencies routinely gave AAA ratings to top tranche of stuff that wasn't even single C.
Wow.
So we
guys,
agree. We got to focus on incentives, and the incentives are pervasively perverse.
Well, hey, real quick, is there a short answer to why the administration won't allow an audit of the Fed or the holdings of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac? They've not. What's his name? The senator that or Congressman Ron Paul keeps calling crazily for an audit of Fannie and Freddie.
Provided any audit was a coalition of right and left that said this is insane, right? And that was over the administration opposition. Well, why? Because the Fed, TARP isn't where the action was. The action was at the Fed, where the Fed took trillions of dollars ultimately in, I'm just going to use bad words, poor quality collateral, which we have other words for in the trade and such, and does huge subsidies. So a large portion, I think, of the academy agrees that the Fed is out of control and is a severe danger, and the administration is not about to cross the Fed, because the Fed is everything in terms of not only the bailout but the cover-up of the scale of the losses of the banks.
And let me add to that.
You want to get the last word.
And the Fed has gotten involved in fiscal policy, basically, working with the Treasury and the administration in dealing with some of the problems that are being confronted or were confronted during the crisis. The other thing I'll point out is, why is it that Bloomberg and Fox News had to file Freedom of Information requests, and when the Fed dragged its feet and didn't supply the information under the Freedom of Information request, Fox News and Bloomberg had to sue? And a district federal judge basically ruled in favor of Bloomberg and Fox News and against the Fed, saying that information about the lending that was done to firms during the crisis should be made public. So again, why is it the Federal Reserve when it controls a monopoly of information, refuses to share that information under Freedom of Information request or to share it with the public. The Fed is a group of unelected individuals with tremendous power. They're really not accountable.
Yeah, they're independent from democracy, but fully dependent on the biggest banks.
And they have they have no budgetary constraint, effectively, whatsoever. So that's the reason they could end up purchasing essentially all those securities that Bill Black talked about. They effectively have the right to print money. They earn interest on all the securities that they acquire, which gives them basically freedom from any budgetary constraints.
And they can dump losses on Freddie and Fannie.
And Bill Black, thank you for sending along that Matt Taibbi's article in Rolling Stone about that. That was terrific. To both of you, thanks again. It's been a great conversation, more than we have expected. And thanks again. I know Jerry will appreciate it, certainly. Thanks for taking so much time on this.
Thank you. It's always good appearing with Bill.
Absolutely. Amen, brother. Take care.